Okay, so we'll go ahead and begin. Our lecture this time is called The Spiritual Significance of Relationship, and we're, in chapter 4 of the book of the lectures on relationship, but this is also can be found at pathwork.org. I'm not clear of the number, but you can actually just type in spiritual significance of relationship pathwork and it'll pop right up. So if people want to go look at the regular lecture. So we're kind of just doing this series of explorations on what the guide has to say about relationship, and partly I'm inspired on this level just because in general people are struggling a lot, and I mean the whole world, like relationship seems to be, failing on so many levels, and I think the guide has some interesting things. I don't know if it has everything about it or if there's but I think, if we can really take this larger look at all of these understandings and apply them to the degree that we can, we're going to, probably find a little better, way of connecting. And I think deep down inside, that's what we really are hungry for and missing, but we're also terrified of because we long for intimacy, we long for deep connection and being seen and being able to see others and feeling the reciprocity and the mutuality. And it just seems like those kinds of experiences are very difficult. Maybe we get a little taste and then everything goes haywire, or, we think it's there and it turns out not to be. So there's all kinds of, sort of challenges with relationship. And the guide talks about how it's sort of the path within the path. And it is sort of the deepest teaching because, even though, we're doing our inner work, that inner work is usually around, the traumas and the difficulties in the history of relationship. And then we keep kind of bringing that into the present, and then we keep sort of recycling the dynamics that are so unfulfilling and painful for us. And so hopefully with this series in this book that we will, just start peeling away the layers of the onion ring and seeing some understandings and some, ways of uh, rethinking things a little bit, feeling our feelings, and moving through things that could help us, be willing in a way to risk again, or, be willing to, you know, open our hearts. And, the whole idea of being undefended in relationship, is the tricky one, right? Okay, so let's go ahead into the lecture. So it's called The Spiritual Significance of Relationship. Greetings, my dearest friends. Blessings for every one of you. Blessed be your very life, your every breath, your thoughts and your feelings. This lecture deals with relationships and their tremendous significance from the spiritual point of view, which is that of individual growth and unification. First, I would like to point out that on the human level of manifestation, individual units of consciousness do exist, which sometimes harmonize, but very often conflict with one another. And this can be internally within ourselves as well as, between each other, right? Creating friction and crisis. Yet behind this level of manifestation, there are no fragmented units of consciousness. There is only one consciousness, of which every single created entity is but a different expression. When one comes into one's own, one experiences this truth without, however, losing a sense of individuality. This can be felt very distinctly when you deal with your own inner disharmonies, my friends, for there too exactly the same principle applies. So, I mean, this is a big statement, and I don't know if I can break it down at this point that much, but it really is kind of like how the guide often approaches things. We've got these two very seemingly opposite qualities or aspects, or, things that generally create conflict, friction, disagreement, disharmony. And yet, he's saying that within that, in and of itself, is an underlying unitive consciousness and an underlying experience of not an either or, but a both and a deeper truth and freedom in that both and, compared to the struggle and the tug of war of the either or. So let's see. Unequal development of parts of consciousness. So this is where, like outside of us, there are many people at different levels of consciousness, and, oftentimes that's part of our difficulty. But he's saying also here that within us, we also have different levels of development. In your present state, a part of your innermost being is developed and governs your thinking, feeling, willing, and acting. There are other parts that are still in a lower state of development, which also govern and influence your thinking, feeling, willing, and acting. And thus you find yourself divided. And this always creates tension, anxiety, pain, as well as inner and outer difficulties. Some aspects of your personality are in truth, others in error and distortion. The resulting confusion causes grave disturbances. What you usually do is push one side out of the way and identify with the other. Yet the denial of a part of you cannot bring unification. This is largely what we're, working with in the IFS work too. It's like this integration rather than this kind of trying to, okay, that part is not right, I want to get rid of it, kind of thing. So on the contrary, that kind of thing, separation, just widens the split. So what must be done is to bring out the deviating, conflicting side and face the entire ambivalence, right? Only then do you find the ultimate reality of your unified self. So again, we have to kind of sit in the mixture of it all, in the totality of it all, and maybe, work through one side and then another, but to get to understanding it much more deeply, and being curious, and wanting to see where we can go as we really get to know these voices at a deeper level. And so when we can do that, then we can find the ultimate reality of our unified self. And of course, he'll hopefully give us some examples of what this means a little more clearly later on in the lecture, because these terms are wide and vague, and it's kind of hard to grasp sometimes philosophically what he's referring to. But he always boils it down into some practical ways. So, and part of it is, that he's saying here that this is our ultimate reality. This is who we really are. And so if we can open to that possibility, even though we don't have a direct experience so much of it, or we don't think we do, I think there's a way that it's, sort of the still small voice inside. It is, this aspect of our being that is just our presence and our awareness. And that innately and naturally, I think, is, here comes Frank, is, a good and, compassionate and curious and, open sense of, who we are. It's like our most intimate self, I think, is at this level. And then we have what the guide talks about is all of these other God opposed layers that kind of, are there for protection, are there to, help us as we've been traumatized or whatever, but they are not our essential nature. They are adaptations that we've been forced into in order to try to survive. Hey, Frank, welcome.
Hey, Darlene. Sorry for coming on late. I was having a little trouble with the Zoom app.
Oh, dear. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're not too late. I think we're just beginning. So
Okay.
glad to have you anytime. So we're on the lecture on the spiritual significance of relationship. So,
Okay.
and here he's talking about, like this way that we have, different levels of consciousness within us as well as all around us. And so in relationship, there are people outside of us that, have different levels of sort of evolution or growth or, consciousness. And then we have our central essential nature that, I think has a lot of our higher self, qualities, or it is our higher self qualities. And then, we have these other parts of us that are, like I said, part of our defenses and part of our protection and part of the adaptation to confusion and trauma when we were, very vulnerable. And so it kind of comes in and becomes a structure around us that tries to protect us, but it is not our essential self. And so when we can kind of at least even open to that possibility, right? It's like then we can see that we're really like seeking to connect with that essential nature. And from that place, maybe the healing and the, clearing of all of the uh, confusion and the pain bodies can happen. So he says, only then do you find the ultimate reality of your unified self. And as you know, unification and peace emerge to the degree that we can recognize, accept, and understand the nature of the inner conflict. So this is such a powerful and true statement, and it's kind of self-obvious maybe, or seems simple, but I just want to highlight it because, like, part of when I do the IFS is what I'm doing is I'm going in, to know this thing for the first time. Like I may have a story about it, I may, be caught up in a story about it, but I really want to go past that story into, being at a deeper level of recognition of really understanding. And if I do the IFS, I find that it generally takes me, and even before then I was doing this process of some kind that would, in a similar way, sort of just follow into the heart of the energy of the conflict of the pain state. And then somehow I would see something that I had never felt or seen before. I would see, the struggle of my inner child. I would see the suffering and the, the desire of the inner child to be in life, to be in love, to be free, but kind of trapped in this state and place. And when I could really understand and see that, it opened my heart to myself in ways that hadn't happened for the forever. And so, this I feel, is part of the way that we actually meet ourselves newly and can deeply, instead of just feeling our faults or our failures or whatever from the outer perspective of how, our parents or our culture or, others we fear see us, that we see ourselves in this incredibly deep way. And in that, a unification takes place at a level that I have not found anything else to get to that level. So it's part of why, and I think IFS is kind of in a general, like pointing in that direction. And so we're just working and exploring how to try to go deeply in and to where we can really see ourselves and understand deeply the nature of the inner conflict. So exactly the same law applies to the unity or dissension between outwardly separate and different entities. They too are one beyond the level of appearance. The dissension is caused not by actual differences among units of consciousness, but just as in the individual, by differences in the development of the manifesting universal consciousness. So we all have a manifesting universal consciousness, and we're all at varying levels of development within that. Even though the principle of unification is exactly the same within and among individuals, it cannot be applied to another human being unless it has first been applied to one's inner self. If the divergent parts of yourself are not approached according to this truth and your ambivalence is not faced, accepted, and understood, the process of unification cannot be put into practice with another person. This is a very important fact which explains the great emphasis of the pathwork on first approaching the self. Right? And, it's like the situations and the pain states and all of that seem to be created, by those around us and outside of us and, the history of it and all of that. And so, we tend to want to resolve it at that level first. Um, I know in a lot of couples work, there's such a desire, to kind of just have the other person see you and really understand you, right? But this is what the guide is saying, the first step is, yeah, we want that and we need that, and it's good when we have that. But we first really need to see ourselves to even begin to experience that. Sorry. So only then can relationship be cultivated in a meaningful and effective way. Elements of dissension and unification. Relationship represents the greatest challenge for the individual, for it is only in relationship to others that the unresolved problems still existing within the individual psyche are affected and activated. And this goes for the others too. It's kind of like, there's this mutuality at first of, triggering each other, right? And in some ways, the closer we are, the more we're likely to trigger each other. You can let go of people that you don't care about or, not that close in relationship. But so, there's this way that, where we kind of want the relationship, but then the closer we get, the more intense it triggers and, affects us. And then in that situation, often many individuals withdraw from interaction with others. And he's saying here to maintain the illusion that the problems arise from the other person because one feels disturbance only in his or her presence and not by oneself. But there's withdrawal for many reasons. I mean, it's just painful, and we can't seem to resolve it, and so we pull back. But it can also be, and you may know people or other people, that tend to kind of just pretend the problems are, not really theirs or, arise outside of themselves and pretty strongly, they don't think about it from this perspective like the pathwork suggests. However, the less the contact is cultivated, the more acute the longing for contact becomes. This then is a different kind of pain. So, it's like this is the usual split is the damned if I do, damned if I don't, death, death, I have a long, slow pain or I have a short, quick pain, right? But either way. And so here he's showing us the split here in this. And so the pain on the other side, the pain of being with people and then the pain of loneliness and frustration. But contact makes it difficult to maintain the illusion for any length of time that the inner self is faultless and harmonious. It requires mental aberration to claim for too long that one's problems in relationship are only caused by others and not by oneself. Now, I want to do a caveat here because I think it's always a both and, right? And so the guide here is being very strong in the self-responsibility piece, and I think it's important. But I think I also want to just, say that we're not crazy. The triggers are not happening because, there's something, amiss just in ourselves. Something is happening, like it's a bouncing off of the defense. So for some reason, the other person is in their defense and we're not meeting each other in the way that we long for. And that triggers us. And so, what we're trying to do is like realize that even if somebody comes to us, in a way that doesn't feel so receptive or, so welcoming or, whatever we're longing for, and then we can, feel our own rejection of them and then of ourselves or whatever that comes up around that. It's usually just the problem is really simpler than that. The problem is not in the the real self of either party. It's in the adaptations of how people have learned to avoid or, or deal with the frictions and the difficulties in life. And so, when we can't get past the defenses, then yeah, the defenses do this, conflictual dance with each other. And so it's good, I think, just to realize, and I know I do this with my, when I get into quarrel with my husband or something like that, that there's this way that I can always, check back and see that maybe the way that I said something was, a little defensive, or how he came at me, I was like innocent completely, and he came out with some kind of a punch. But it's like it's very obvious where it's coming from. It's very obvious, for myself, that he loves me. And so when you have that kind of foundational, support and connection, the kerfuffles don't create the same difficulty as when there's not the foundation really established. And so, when we're not feeling connectedness, then yeah, it just feels like we're, sleeping with the enemy at some level. And to some degree, it's equally true, that they are as responsible as we are. But the trick there is that, it's probably ultimately easier to change ourselves than it is to change them. And we want to be heard. And again, I think that goes to this first place of really sitting and hearing ourselves deeply, deeply. And then, in varying degrees, we can still speak up in a way that, is speaking truth, but it's not defensive. And so, then when we feel that, we know, if they, if we're speaking truth, they're either going to hear us or not, but it's not anything from us that, is creating the reaction, if we're getting a reaction. So that's kind of where, we begin to navigate on a little more solid ground, to me, where we can, sort of recognize the defenses. And of course, when we're triggered, we can't just control it. Um, and we don't need to be ashamed of it. We need to use that as an opportunity, once we wake up out of the trigger, to really explore it again. What just happened? How can I, like, I'm now no longer merged with that dynamic. Let me see if I can hold myself, understand myself, see myself deeply. What just happened? And so when we can do that with the triggers, and then we can, slowly also feel our own truth and ground, then it gives us a more resilience and a solid place to stand when other people are dealing with that, and like they're in reaction, and we're innocent in that situation, right? Or it's a dynamic that they're playing out, and we're just currently not in that dynamic in that moment. So we can somehow step forward into a different relational space when we don't get triggered, and that can make a huge difference in any relationship. So let me pause here for a minute. Comments, questions? Okay. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
I have
Mhm.
a comment.
Okay.
I might add that over time, one if you've studied the path work and how the psychology of the path work, that you might over time understand the psychology of your partner more. I mean,
Absolutely.
you'll understand the ISI of your partner. You'll understand the lower self impulses of your partner. You'll understand, what triggers your partner, and how to kind of bring them back to home plate, so to speak, you know, when they are triggered. So, I mean, there's a lot going on there. I mean, if you take into account all the personality parts of two people put together, it just gets, you know, it can get a little tricky.
Amen. Yeah. And ideally maybe, in a as the relationship heals, your partner can also do that for you, because that's when it gets really good, when you can really be aids and supports for each other in the traumatized places, right?
Yeah,
But
if you're on the same page as far as your understanding of psychology goes, but if you're not on the same page, then
and it's
you
more
can't
than
speak
just
the
the
same
understanding.
language. It's hard if you're not speaking the same language.
Right. I mean, that helps for sure, to have, like, and so you can talk to your partner and mention, that, you experienced something about their ISI and I would know what you're saying and stuff like that.
Right,
I agree.
right.
Yeah, it makes a big difference to have a couple that are both in this path, but it's not required. It helps, but
Yeah,
I think that there's a way again, and just not only like as you read and understand yourself, you're going to understand their defenses, and even if they don't understand their own, or so much, that you have an edge and you have a way of working with it, as well. And I don't know, people, I think as we claim our own self-responsibility in our spaces. And it always amazed me because, my husband never did any of this work, right? But he would get triggered by me, and then, he would kind of in this way of humor exaggerate, and he would say something to the effect that, like, everything is always all my fault, and it was so so exaggerated. I could tell he was just expressing without aiming, right? Like, even though it was all my fault, it was like it was so exaggerated. I knew he was completely owning it.
right.
And then he was just, finding a way to discharge some energy, right? And I always found that was, a really useful way for me, for him to, and we didn't have a lot of deep conversations about what was going on, or working it all out in that way. But it's like if the other person can at least be in their own way kind of self-responsible for their experience, it also makes a really good big difference. And again, most people in our culture and in the in our times right now, like, we really still do uh, see mostly the clear reflection of what the other person is triggering in us, and we see that the if only that person would stop doing that, we would be happy. And
Yeah, also I would say my personal experience, the further I've gone down the path work, uh, the less I would be able to have a relationship with someone who is not anywhere near the path. You know what I mean? Someone who is just constantly bouncing off of their triggers, and
absolutely.
it would just be too difficult to be in a relationship with someone like that.
Exactly. And the guide is saying that, I think it was in that last lecture that we read, too, that like it's it's like we outgrow relationships.
Yeah, yeah,
And it doesn't really serve us always to, like, think that we, have to make it work with just that one person.
right.
There's also problems when we're, just bouncing around from, to various different relationships. But so Skylar is joining us. Um,
Oh wow, I haven't seen Skylar in a while.
Yeah, she joined us one time a little while ago recently, but
Hello,
hey,
Hello.
Skylar,
hey Skylar.
Nice.
welcome. So
Hi.
we're just continuing in this lecture on the spiritual significance of relationships. So hopefully you can just catch up with us. I know it's a lot earlier there for you, so you probably just got off work, right?
No, actually, yeah, I just got off the session. Wednesdays are my only days off, and the week, including the weekend.
Uh,
Yeah.
okay. All right. Well, welcome. So yeah, and we're just talking about all things relationship here a little bit, and just sort of Frank just had mentioned, and we're talking about sort of the different levels of consciousness within us and then between us, and also how um, when two people are more or less conscious, you can really work through those. When somebody is like completely in their inner child state, basically, or they haven't gotten enough consciousness, whether it's through the path or some other therapy or system, if they have some awareness, I think then it's more possible. But the guide does say that we're kind of looking for the reflection of ourselves. And in the beginning, when we're young, we may find it in one way, but as we grow and develop, we're going to evolve. And so it may very well be that we outgrow a relationship. And also, we're still learning about what is a healthy relationship. So we may have some old dependencies or attachments or even sort of eros attached to certain aspects of people that are really not healthy for us in some way, where oftentimes the guide says that we're unconsciously attracted to people that have similar incapacities to love us as did our parents. But because we're in a situation where we're trying to correct that original situation, we unconsciously feel that this is a good candidate, right? And we can convert them somehow or change them or get them to finally love us the way we needed to be loved. But because they have the same limitations, this usually does result in just a recreation of childhood hurts, and it doesn't really take us where we want. So there is a lot of stuff in all of this relationship. So let's go back to the lecture and see if we can just ground it in what this level is talking about. So he says, so the friction that arises out of relating with others can be a sharp instrument of purification and self-recognition if one is inclined to use it. And so by withdrawing from the challenge and sacrificing the fulfillment of intimate contact, many inner problems are really never called into play. And so then we don't have an opportunity to work through them. It's like if we do the withdrawal mask or, and so again, I want to just say that, like we often think from the ego's place that, oh, all of this frustration in a relationship just means that there's something wrong with us or we're terrible at it. But I think it really means that we are bringing out all of our issues of intimate contact, working through them so that, we can find fulfillment in that realm. And so again, how you understand what's happening in your journey, is can make a difference on how you feel about your life and yourself. So the illusion of inner peace and unity that comes from avoidance of relating has even led to concepts that spiritual growth is furthered by isolation. Monks and monasteries and that kind of thing. And maybe there was some reasons for that and positive things, but I think there is a way that, that does just delay. And so this person would have to incarnate and, come back into relationship to work through sort of the sharp points of the porcupine quills that, we all have around us. So the statement must not be confused with the notion that intervals of seclusion are necessary for inner concentration and self-confrontation. But these periods should always alternate with contact. And the more intimate such contact is, the more it expresses spiritual maturity. Contact and lack of contact with others can be observed in various stages. There are many degrees of contact between the crass extremes of total outer and inner isolation at one end, and the deepest, most intimate relatedness at the other. There are those who have obtained a certain superficial ability to relate, but who still withdraw from a more meaningful, open, unmasked, mutual revealing. So this is where I think we run into a lot of people, like that this whole world is full of people that are great at superficial abilities to relate and have their masks and stuff. But I go to many places, and it's such a night and day thing. I go to these medicine ceremonies together with all of these people that are like wide open, and the heart connection and the presence and the beauty and the depth that you see just in their eyes and their voices, compared to the kind of mechanical, egoic, disconnected beings that you run into in most places, in the world. And so, we really are trying to evolve into this other representative of humanness. But right now, where we mostly are is in a very, separated state, a very fearful state, and a very hidden state. And then, as long as we're doing that, we really can't resolve any of that. So this is where, he's saying exposure and just being out there, even if it looks terrible or, seems like it makes you the worst, is really a more, direct path to your inner growth. The more that we avoid or try to protect or mask, now, we need to be grounded. We need to be, connected to ourselves for sure. So this is where I think we get lost sometimes, is like we turn against ourselves in this kind of situation. So again, I just want to say that, like for me, the foundation is that inner work with, really seeing and embracing all aspects of ourselves. So fulfillment as a yardstick for personal development. It is also possible to measure one's personal sense of fulfillment by the depth of relatedness and intimate contact, by the strength of feelings one permits oneself to experience, and by the willingness to give and receive. And many of us, like, again, we may have a lot of this, but, we are frustrated in the sense that we don't have people to, share it with or give it to or connect with in some ways. And that can also be something to look at within us, a hidden inner no to some degree. But, there really is this deepest self in us that longs for this depth of relatedness and intimate contact and real depth of feelings and, the willingness then to just be there and give and receive. So frustration indicates an absence of contact, which in turn is a precise indicator that the self withdraws from the challenge of relationship, thereby sacrificing personal fulfillment, pleasure, love, and joy. When you want to share only on the basis of receiving, according to your own terms, and you are in fact secretly unwilling to share, your longings must remain unfulfilled. People would be well advised to consider their unfulfilled longings from this point of view, rather than indulging the usual assumption that one is unlucky or unfairly put upon by life. One's contentment and fulfillment in relationship is a much neglected yardstick for development. Relationship with others is a mirror of one's own state, and thus a direct help to one's self-purification. Conversely, only by thorough self-honesty and self-facing can relationships be sustained, can feelings expand, and contact blossom in long-term relationships. Like in that Eros lecture, if you never reveal yourself, nothing can blossom. It'll be there for a little while, and then you close down, and then you get bored with each other, and go seeking Eros elsewhere. So you can see, my friends, that relationship represents a truly important aspect of human growth. The power and significance of relationship often pose severe problems for those who are still in the throes of their own inner conflicts. The unfulfilled longing becomes unbearably painful when isolation is chosen due to the difficulty of contact. You see, you're in a real tough bind there. So it's good to really see the compassion and the struggle in this, and understand that it really is this rock in a hard place, this pulling apart, this and so we can really see ourselves, I think, in these places with great compassion and understanding. And when we can do that, it can make a difference also in the movement of, being with and then going through and out the other side of these difficulties. So it can be resolved when you seriously settle down to seek the cause for this conflict within yourself, without using the defense of annihilating guilt and self-blame, which is like really a lot of sort of these, I don't know, there's, in this shamanic study of mine, I'm beginning to believe that these voices that attack us in this way, it's like I think they're connected with our ISI, but I think they are actually part of the negative specialists that the guide talks about that come to really, hurt us in that way. And maybe love is the answer for them too, but I think first of all, to really see that whatever they're doing, like it's ultimately not the truth. And maybe they're scared, maybe, they're trying to scare us, just to make sure that, we never try again, that we never, risk again, they're gonna kind of, really try to cause ourselves to contract into, nothingness, disappear into a hole, leave, do whatever, So these kinds of voices are, part of, how we struggle in pain with these kinds of conflicts. But if we can become, aware really that that kind of defense, and he says it is a defense, so it's like interesting how, I mean, we're harming ourselves by this defense. We're literally, raking ourselves across the coals, in trying to prevent our own pain. So it's a really oxymoron kind of dynamic that we go into here. But I did it to myself, and I understand to some degree, this part of us, it just wants to, it blames ourselves. It wants to annihilate us for not doing it the way it thinks it should have been in order for us to be successful and to receive the, the connections that we wanted. And so when it turns against us, again, in my work, I saw like it was really this absolutely terrified child that was attacking me. And so I think it's okay to kind of have both of these. There's a negative specialist in this, and then there's also our own, self attack, like our belief that somehow we are not okay, and we want to destroy ourselves in that place. This search, together with the inner willingness to change, must be cultivated in order to escape the painful dilemma in which both available alternatives, isolation and contact, are unbearable. So again, this is how we get into these splits, right? And so we need both isolation and contact, when we split them, and then we're stuck in isolation, that's painful, or we're stuck in negative contact, that's painful, right? And so it's part of the way that we're trying to work ourselves out of duality. Any questions, comments?
I still think that the lecture on recreating and healing old wounds should have come long before this one.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting. I
It's
always
kind of
find
out of
that that's kind of the
sequence, you know?
foundation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's coming up, but we haven't got it to yet.
It should come before this.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it helps to, like be able to bring it in a little bit anyway. But yeah, I agree. It kind of really is the foundation of where all of this comes from. And more, there's that lecture, there's the whole lecture on ISI and stuff like that. So yeah. And there is a usefulness in understanding this psychology, but even though understanding it is helpful, there's a deeper dive that has to be done in the actual transformation of it. It's like, but to actually just really recognize and understand what's going on can be an important first step. So it is important to remember that withdrawal can be very subtle and may be outwardly unnoticeable, manifesting only in a certain guardedness or distorted self-protection. Outer good fellowship does not necessarily imply a capacity and willingness for inner closeness. For many, closeness is too taxing. On the surface, this seems related to how difficult others are, but actually the difficulty lies in the self, regardless of how imperfect others may be. And I feel this, there's certain others that I find very taxing, right? But I think this is also, where the layers of consciousness are. And the guide has another lecture where he says, like at a certain point, it gets painful for, a more evolved consciousness to, be with those others. But he says it's really important to learn to, establish your patience, your presence, your capacity for even being with them. It's not that they're going to be your deep, intimate, special other or anything, but, that there is this way that, we want to, learn how to not silo ourselves as best we can. And, I struggle with this and work with this as well. A part of me, only wants to interact and be with people that can follow me or like, are along in the same, journey with me, right? But I have to practice and learn also a way of being in relationship on another level, even in the beauty of the community that I was referring to before. I was aware and caught myself a couple of times of just sort of having this kind of flat-footed autistic child in me be there, right? And so I love her and I wasn't mad at her, but I realized after the fact, oh, I should have responded this way, and I would have loved to have responded this way. And I'm sorry I didn't respond this way. But, like it just wasn't there in the moment, right? And so uh, there's a way that, we're always kind of in our defenses in varying degrees around others. It's like it's a kind of habitual place that I go to, and the more present that I am in those situations, the more the spontaneous, expression of the very things in my heart that I want to express are going to be there, right? That's blocked when I'm somehow tangled in a defense or, disconnected in some way. But when I'm truly present, then everything is in a kind of divine inner relationship and process with other people that can be very beautiful. Who is responsible for the relationship? When people whose spiritual development is on different levels are involved with one another, it is always the more highly developed person who is responsible for the relationship. Specifically, that person is responsible for searching the depths. It's like they're not to blame or they're not, to control the relationship, but they are responsible for searching the depths of the interaction, which creates the friction and disharmony between the parties. The less developed person is not as capable of such a search, being still in a state of blaming the other, depending on the other's doing right in order to avoid unpleasantness or frustration. Also, the less developed person is always caught up in the fundamental error of duality. From his or her perspective, any friction is seen in terms of only one of us is right. A problem in the other automatically seems to whitewash this person, although in reality his or her own negative involvement may be more weighty than the other person's. The spiritually more developed person is capable of realistic, non-dualistic perception. That person may see that either one of you may have a deep problem, but that does not eliminate the importance or the possibility, much lesser problem of the other one. importance of the possibly much lesser problem of the other one. The more developed one will always be willing and able to search for his or her own involvement whenever he or she is negatively affected, no matter how blatantly at fault the other may be. So that's really kind of, part of the path of doing relationship work, I think, in this. And again, it's not about, you're the problem or you're to blame or anything like that, but it is about, oh, somehow I'm in a space where we're creating, this difficult dynamic, right? And so I'm curious, right? And I want to be curious about your part of it too, but if I can't talk to you or we can't have this kind of in-depth way of exploring, then I can always do this inner work first with myself. And then maybe in doing that, something can shift and a conversation can happen, or maybe even that the behavior changes. It's amazing how we can change other people around us, without trying to control them, right? It's like as we come more into our center, it naturally helps other people, I think, do that. And so anyway, let's see. A person of spiritual and emotional immaturity and crudeness will always put the bulk of the blame on the other, but this applies to any kind of relationship, mates, parents and children, friendships, or business contacts. The tendency to make yourself emotionally dependent on others, the overcoming of which is such an important aspect of the growth process, largely comes from wanting to absolve yourself from blame or extract yourself from difficulty when establishing and maintaining a relationship. It seems much easier to shift most of the burden to others, but what a price to pay. Doing this renders you helpless indeed and brings about isolation, unending pain, or friction with others. It is only when you begin truly to assume self-responsibility by looking at your own problems in the relationship and show a willingness to change that freedom is established and relationships become fruitful and joyous. So I'm going to say here, this feels a little bit like, in an ideal situation, where there's not like all of these deep entanglements that we usually have in our, deep personal relationships by now, right? And so like these are good principles, right? But it feels to me like, he's making this a little bit easier than it really is. This takes a deep sort of willingness to see also, like to not take the blame all on yourself, but to understand that when you can find your piece of it, that's a kind of key that can help you. And then the more that you can clearly see your dynamic, again, the more you can see them. And it may be that what you're seeing is, this relationship doesn't seem to have any potential for intimacy of the depth that you really wanted, or of the kind of support or the kind of connection that you are seeking. And so I think we need to simply acknowledge that without blaming ourselves or without blaming the other person, right? That there is a way in which we're growing apart, or the person's limited ability of self-reflection doesn't allow any deepening of their work. And while you're deepening your side of it, it still may be that the eros or the connection between you is not there sufficiently to make it the relationship, that would continue and become generative, become supportive of each other. So, sometimes it's hard because, like in this world, particularly if we have a relationship, it's like the alternative of going into an isolated state, even when the relationship is not the greatest, is serious. And we don't often at our ages have, new ways of meeting new people or whatever. So, it's like there's strong forces that try to keep us, together. And then sometimes, though, this is the aspect where we really have to learn to tune into the deepest guidance and try to really, you know, make contact with the soul, aspect of our nature, and try to understand where it needs to go, what it really needs. And I think oftentimes when we do leave a negative relationship because, we're still caught in some of those dynamics, we often recreate it again, but it's also usually a slightly different thing and we see it a little more. And so I think there is a usefulness in, leaving, but where there's maybe no contact after that, it's like there's lots of factors to consider, and then financial security and children or whatever, people are, this is a deep, deep process, and because of these bonds, it can be very profound in our evolutionary journey. um, and because of our struggles and fights and pulling apart and pushing each other and trying to, it we grow, whether it's really what we long for in a relationship or not. It's going to help us in the long run. And then it is kind of our journey to discern, whether this is the relationship we want, or if there's something else. And then where there's already isolation and no relationship, there's this whole journey of exploring one, finding somebody that kind of is enough at your level that there's this real contact that can happen. And by that I mean that the other person has to be also willing to be that open and that vulnerable, and that connecting. So again, these people are few and far between, hard to find. And I think what I believe is really that, it's like other things in life, when we're ready, like the configuration of fate and destiny or whatever, might, bring those things together for us. And that as we do this work, that, helps us uh, open those portals and those possibilities.
I'd just like to say that I think that personal growth or spiritual evolution is like a process of self-discovery. It's a joyful process of self-discovery. And if you're with a partner who's kind of like makes that happen for you, that's great. But if you're with a partner who stalling that, or you're blocked with that partner, then it's pretty obvious you're with the wrong partner.
And it's still useful to do your own work around that, because even staying or going, you're going to gain from that. But yeah, it's like probably it's something that won't change sufficiently you know, the availability of the other partner.
Yeah. Relationships are very tricky. Even friendships, I mean, this doesn't necessarily, what we're talking about here doesn't necessarily have to be all about
Men,
man and woman relationships. This could be
primary, yeah.
This could be a friendship kind of thing too. You're with a friend, or you have a friend, or you want to call that person a friend or whatever. And they're just not on the same page. When you get around that person, you don't feel like they're feeding your process of self-discovery. They're stalling you in some way. And oftentimes you will hesitate to say anything about it because you just don't want to hurt that person. You might, when reality, when you're with them, you're just not getting anything from them. You're not getting anything, feels like anything real from them. You're getting a pretense or some kind of a mask. And you know, you want more. You want more than a mask or a pretense. Gosh.
Yeah.
I'm talking about some friends that I have, I guess, you know. But hey, that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly. It can be, and again, there's a type of mutuality that we're seeking, right? And so the mutuality of what you want to give, you're ready to give, you're willing to give, is
Mm,
what you want to meet you, right? and
yeah.
and that's where and then yeah, the mystery of how we run into those people, find them in our lives or experience them is a whole other journey and process. But I think the guide is saying that when we can um, sort of really know ourselves, that self-knowledge, that self-acceptance, and that self-responsibility, that the pathwork kind of is the foundation, then if there is a chance for the connection to happen, a real communication. I mean, even if somebody is not being real, you might, in your humble realness, ask them, knowing that they may not get it, or they may reject it, or they may refuse, but like, again, we have to be that vulnerable to really ask for what we need. And when we are unwilling to do that, there's some part of our piece, maybe. What we also run into a lot, and I know through all of the times in MAP that we've had various, conflicts in different groups and stuff like that, that there's just this way that we do believe in confronting, like, in a way to speak truth, to
Mm.
have an honest, like, so we don't have to mask or pretend or hide sort of maybe our difficulty. But I find in general that to confront versus to question, like, so sometimes if we think, I see you doing this or whatever, we think that's
Right.
confronting, and that doesn't usually let people be open enough to consider, or go deeper with it, but they would put up their own defenses. And oftentimes, when we feel a confrontation is needed, it's true, and yet it's a very, very delicate operation of how to do that, if you're truly trying to maintain the relationship. Now, if you're if you're really just wanting to tell the person, a piece of the truth, it's fine sometimes not to be so delicate about it, but you got to realize that, that's probably not going to bring them closer, or, have a, uh, you know, more open discussion about it, but uh, I find some.
Would you say that defense, putting up a defense is a form of pain management?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's
Yeah.
implied anyway.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm not quite following your question. What would you say?
Well, you know, hard pain of or soft pain. I'm still a little confused about hard pain and soft pain, but let's say,
Mm,
you know, you have a childhood wound, and your trigger into that wound brings up pain. And if you are triggered, let's say you're in a group, a path work group, and you're being prodded to open up and you can't, and your defense comes up, wouldn't that be like a pain management situation?
absolutely.
Yeah. And that can happen in relationships too. When your defense comes up, you're managing some kind of ancient pain body that, you know,
I
you
think
can't
always.
define it. You would not be able to define it. You might not. You might wouldn't be able to say, "Listen, my defense is up because I'm managing this part of my pain body." No, you know.
I mean, you could. I mean, that's partly the goal, is to be that conscious around
Yeah,
it,
if you,
and see it.
yeah,
But yeah, in the beginning, usually, yeah, you think, you know, and it's often not so clear, like what the hurt is we're defending against, because we're defending so strongly we don't know what's underneath it.
Mm,
And then, like you said, there's the difference between the hard pain and the soft pain.
yeah.
And I think mostly we're defending against the hard pain because that's the unbearable pain that we can't actually accept, but it's not real at some level. The hard pain comes from the judgment against ourselves or the situation.
Yeah, like in my case, it would be my judgment against myself for not being perfect. It's like inside of me, I'm thinking I need to be perfect.
Right.
you know so if you trigger me into a situation where I'm my perfectionism is threatened, my defense is going to come up, which is kind of ridiculous because I know that I'm not perfect. I know I
Right.
can't
And
be
and that's where
perfect.
but the defense is probably against the shame of being imperfect. And then,
Yeah,
the shame is what we have to transform into, dignity and humility.
yeah,
Because the shame, that was experienced by the child out, from others, like caused it to internalize that shame.
right.
And so we have to, like, heal it out of us, and know the truth about that shame, and then it can transform into this sort of real sense of dignity in our true being, and a real sense of humility also, that says I don't have to be perfect. I'm a child.
Yeah,
I'm a child of God, but I'm a child. and
yeah.
and
I mean,
so I can be very, very imperfect and still be forgiven, still be loved, still be held, still be, supported and not shamed.
yeah, self-forgiven more
Yes,
than anything. Self-forgiven,
yes,
that's
absolutely.
in a
Right,
in a soft and understanding way. I mean, we have all these hard experiences, hard pain relationship experiences all the time, but they don't lead us to a soft understanding. Unfortunately, there's a short circuit there, and we never get to the soft understanding that's on the other side of the hard pain.
right. And that is because we don't quite, I mean, like, we don't know the difference. I mean, the hard pain, we have to wake up to the judgment behind it because it's not real and it's not the truth. And so that's the illusion that we're trying to dispel. And once we see that, then we can be in the soft pain. And then the soft pain can be felt and released and freed, and it becomes part of our joy. Soft pain is not a problem in life. It's only the hard pain. And of course, some soft pain, like, deep loss and that kind of stuff, is real, so it doesn't just clear immediately, in some ways. But if we don't take it into some kind of story that says, something's wrong with me, them, the situation, whatever, then we can sort of just be with it in faith and feel like, all of nature and is supporting us, right? Our journey, the guide says, here on earth, even though it's very challenging and intense, is very truly safe. It's truly, healing. It's truly, benign, and trying to, evolve us and help us. So when we can, be in the experience of life in that way, rather than sort of feeling like we're being attacked on all sides, and we have to protect ourselves all the time, we can open up to a different kind of experience of life, I think.
Would you say that the hard pain is self-inflicted mostly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm trying to think of some example where it might not be, but almost always, like it's built into the story, right? So it's in the image,
In
and
the
it
image?
and it implies,
Yes.
that something, shouldn't be.
Mhm.
And so when you say that shouldn't be, like, you're not surrendered, you're not accepting what is, you're not being with it. And
Mm.
when you're in resistance to that degree, right, with what is here now, and you're fighting it, and you're rebelling against it, and you're, uh, just really intensely, afraid of it or whatever, that, that adds to the whole drama trauma of the circumstance, right? And if you kind of are working the path, and something shows up that's like difficult, and you can sort of make your connection, with the help that and the support that you need, and kind of like, okay, something's coming, help me face it, help me be with it, help me work it, help me go through this wherever it's going to take me. And then kind of start with, instead of the way that the world is a problem, start with this, okay, I'm aligned and present, and trying to navigate, trying to do my best that I can navigate life as it's approaching me right now in this, situation. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I just find that, kind of uh, realizing that everything in my experience is actually, confronting me in this kind of way that if I don't turn against myself, it can be, this beautiful guidance system. One of my hymns says,
Right.
my life is my guide.
Right. I mean, that is the key, not turning against yourself, not being, beating yourself up. That's the key.
And exactly. And when we can learn not to do that, and then just trust that the life that is showing up, even though sometimes it can be, I mean, out of the blue, somebody dies, or you have some, it can be very intense, you lose your home, but that somehow, even in the midst of that kind of, drama and intensity and loss, that there still is, something bigger happening, something, beautiful happening, something, taking us across that canyon into a new life or something. It shows up for a reason, and we all, can fight it and resist it and struggle against it, and that only tightens the noose and makes it all more difficult. It's not going to change. It's still there. Now we're just resisting it. And there's a saying, what we resist persists, right? And that's been my experience, right? As long as I'm resisting, it's going to keep showing up. And so the practice is just, really into the surrender stuff. But that is a bigger mystery, and a harder thing. And it's like what you're saying, Frank, is like not turning against yourself, loving yourself, and accepting, that what is, can be met, and probably is actually trying to take you into a beautiful new potential state, but when we're used to certain things, we don't like change. We like things the way we like them. We're kind of creatures of habit. I see myself all the time, something shows up differently than I expected, and I'm almost immediately at war with it. And it's a kind of reflexive reaction, right? So I don't judge myself or make myself bad for it, but that's, I notice it, right? And see how, oh, there's this surrender that's trying to get born in me, and how my egoic nature is, like, I want what I want when I want it now. and I don't wasn't expecting this, or this isn't how it should be, or this is, and so then if I contract against it, it will make it harder. If I can learn how to breathe, I don't have to like it. I just have to accept that it is what it is. And then I can ground with it. And if I can, and in that acceptance, like, try to just breathe it is how I usually think of it. It's like, okay, I don't like this, but I'm just standing here, and I'm breathing the feeling, breathing the state, breathing the resistance, breathing the whole thing, just holding myself in this, tension. It's a tension zone, right? And if I can just allow myself to stay there and connect with all of that, it will come to me or pass through me, or inspiration will inspire me. I will see something in that I had never seen before. If I go to my defense and immediately resist it, or go into the story, or then the miracle that is within that situation I miss, because I'm not present for it, because it's
That's
like
where the
it's,
circuit gets shorted out.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the
And so the
circuit.
higher self
I mean,
can't.
it's me, Darlene. I'm kind of like a distiller. I like to distill everything down to the simplest,
Yeah,
equation.
yeah.
And these days, I kind of understand that if I could take my hard pain and transform it into a soft understanding, it would be all I needed to do. You know,
Yeah,
that would be all I needed to do to have peace
right. And
in
easier
my
said than
heart.
done, so the problem is always in, okay, so how do we take these concepts, these understandings, they really are illuminated understandings, right, that we're receiving, but then we have to embody them. We have to bring them down into the very cells of our bodies. And
Yeah.
so then we practice. We understand a little more, and then the universe keeps giving us more opportunities to practice. Another fucking growth opportunity, right? And so we just keep practicing, and with each of those, we get a little further. We deepen it. We ground it.
Well, but the catalyst for that, for my equation, is self-forgiveness. I mean, that's basically what, where the,
Exactly. If you don't forgive it, then yeah, you will turn against yourself, and then you will be stuck in it and really recreating it.
exactly.
If you recognize, oh, I'm doing that again, and don't turn against yourself, then you have an opportunity to change it.
Yeah.
Then little by little you will advance it in a different direction, right? In an improved direction. So you're exactly right. When we turn against ourselves, then that blocks the whole thing of the inner growth. We can't move it from there. So yeah, we have to be humbly imperfect, and dealing with all of these things, and accepting that they are here, and that we are fine, or that we don't have to be angry at ourselves or at the universe or God, for the whole thing. And yet we still feel that way, right? So it's okay that parts of us still feel that way. Don't merge with those parts. Notice that this is where we're, aiming to stay in a place where we can accept it. And then notice that there are also parts of us that do not want to accept it. And so then we can go in and integrate that piece of resistance, not try to get rid of it, not try to make us wrong for still having it or any of that, but just say, okay, I notice something inside me still holds on to the, fear or the judgment or whatever it is. And as we sit with it and feel into it, even just being in that presence of it can bring light to it, can start dissolving it, can bring new understanding and awareness to it. So when we sit in an embodied presence with whatever, our state is, but we're also with our observer kind of with it, like noticing and being with it instead of merged totally with it and unconsciously identified, then we have, the keys to the ability to transform that within us. And I don't know if that's, a little more steps or more complex, because it all does boil down to what you're saying. But I think, in my journey, there are some, other steps that sometimes seem useful.
You have some extra steps.
That's a point, but how do you get there? Right. Yeah, don't judge yourself. But then when you have self-judgment, how do you transform that? Right. Is
Yeah,
part of the question.
oh, it's hard. Yeah, and you know what? I play golf, so like if when you play golf, you think that, okay, I'm going to hit a perfect shot. Nothing less than a perfect shot will do here. And then you don't hit the perfect shot, and then you got to go through this whole machination inside of yourself. It's like, oh, why couldn't I hit a perfect shot? And then you
Why
get
was it the way it was? Yes.
yeah, it's like, and there's no other sport on earth that really is like that. It's because the ball is not moving. So there's no reason why you should not hit a perfect shot.
Yeah. So yeah, and so that's your story. That's your way of perceiving it, right, through a certain lens, and then it adds to this belief or this, position that says, well, then I should be able to make a perfect shot. So why am I not,
Because I'm not perfect. And then it's like through this whole thing is like, oh my God, I'm not perfect. Yeah.
We are perfectly imperfect.
Yeah.
Like when we can really fall in love with however we are in the moment, that's a good place to be as well, and we're never perfect. So, and I think the whole perfection thing again is, with the ISI is kind of like part of that. The guide talks about, I think in that lecture, where we feel like we want to have these stilts of pride and specialness, right? And it's this idea as children, we looked around and then, who's getting all the love and attention? Oh, that guy, because he's special in some way, he's specially good at that, or people pay attention to, so we look around and we see, and the guide says we literally substitute specialness for love. We don't know how to get love. And he says, mature, healthy love is really not all that available, even from our parents. And so, we want, this love, and yet, we can't seem to get it. And so then the next best thing is to be king on the mountain, is to be special, is to be one up on everybody else. And
Right.
and yet that is a total recipe for disaster.
Indeed.
I still remember till these days when I was in the first grade, first couple of grades, they would have us come into to the board and just kind of talk about certain paragraphs in a school book that we read about whatever it is, geography or about whichever subject we had, literature. And I literally, if I started talking, like I would recall everything word to word. That's how I would try to memorize. And if by any chance I forget one word in a sentence, I forget everything else. I still remember that guy just literally followed me. He would read the paragraph and he would follow like I'm reading the paragraph. We're trying to. It was insane, and that's how perfect I was trying to be,
Right. Yeah.
word to word, till this day. It's
Yeah.
pure frustration if I can't recollect or recall certain memories or certain things I've read about. It's like, why can't I remember what it was, what it was saying exactly? Why do I have to put my own words in it? Why can't I remember it objectively, how it was said, how it was done? There's still a bit of a judgment there.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. You're reminding me there's a medicine wheel that, like when you first come out, like as into the field of life from the children's fire, you go into the east, which is considered the contrary lodge. And it's considered the contrary lodge because, like you're asking all of these questions. Why is the sky blue? Why is it this way? Why is it that way? Why is it, so, and the native peoples, they consider asking questions like why is something the way it is a kind of contrary state, because you're asking God, to explain to you why he's doing what he's doing, right? And so there's a certain sort of aspect of our individual, contrariness in that, and so it's partly again this understanding of, being with what is and accepting it for the time being. Maybe there's action that we can take, or improvements that we can make, or something like that. But if we, reject and have to, make God account for everything, there is this little bit of struggle in our situation that yeah, like you said, like it can never bring peace, right? It's always wanting to be a little better or a little more perfect. And I think, again, that's that ISI trying to manipulate life, so it can control life in
Or it's
some.
like getting rid of a creative process. Everything should be a creative flow, right?
Right,
We're trying to put it in a box of no,
right,
this is how
right,
it's supposed to be. It should be. For some reason, there's no way around it, or it's just
right. Yeah, it's anti-life because it is this kind of, thing instead of a process, instead of a movement, instead of a, development and a, ongoing thing. We have to freeze it in time and make it somehow perfect, right? Whatever the hell that means at any given moment, right? And we're never going to meet that bar. It's never going to be successful. That's one of the things the guide talks about, the ISI being, such a useless and painful process, because, even if we do get that good, the bar's just going to get raised.
yeah, right.
Okay, well, we've diverged quite a bit here, but let's see what happens if we go back to the lecture a little bit. Good discussion. I'm totally happy with all of it. But I guess we might want to finish the lecture, so let me see if I can find out where we left off. I'm just going to start here. I don't remember. If the more highly developed person refuses to undertake the appropriate spiritual duty to assume responsibility for the relationship and look for the core of dissension within, he or she will never really understand the mutual interaction, how one problem affects the other. So there is always this mutual dynamic. And so somebody's got to kind of pull back and begin to see it, and ideally if both parties can, but if not, then whoever can. The relationship must then deteriorate, leaving both parties confused and less able to cope with the self and others. On the other hand, if the spiritually developed person accepts this responsibility, he or she will also help the other in a subtle way. If he or she can desist from the temptation to constantly belabor the obvious sour points of the other and look within, he or she will raise his or her own development considerably and spread peace and joy. The poison of friction can be eliminated. It will become possible to find other partners. It will also become possible to find other partners for a truly mutual growth process. So again, he's saying, you don't have to stay with the same partner, but you still have to do the work, because it's like we're going to carry it into whatever relationship that we have ultimately. When two equals relate, both carry the full responsibility for the relationship. This is indeed a beautiful venture, a deeply satisfying state of mutuality. The slightest flaw in a mood, and this is kind of what we're all longing for, will be recognized for its inner meaning, and thus the growth process is kept up. Both will recognize their co-creation of this momentarily flaw, be it an actual friction or a momentary deadness of feelings. The inner reality of the interaction will become increasingly more significant. This will largely prevent injury to the relationship. Let me emphasize here that when I speak of being responsible for the less developed person, I do not mean that another human being can ever carry the burden for the actual difficulties of others. This can never be. What I mean is that difficulties of interaction in a relationship are usually not explored in depth by the individual whose spiritual development is more primitive. He or she will render others responsible for his or her unhappiness and disharmony in a given interaction, and is not able or willing to see the whole issue. Thus, that person is not in a position to eliminate the disharmony. Only those who assume responsibility for finding the inner disturbance and mutual effect can do so. Hence, the spiritually more primitive person always depends on the spiritually more evolved one. A relationship between individuals in which the destructiveness of the less developed one makes growth, harmony, and good feelings impossible, or in which the contact is overwhelmingly negative, should be severed. As a rule, the more highly developed person should assume the initiative. If he or she does not, this indicates some unrecognized fear that needs to be faced. If a relationship is dissolved on this ground, namely that it is more destructive and pain-producing than constructive and harmonious, it should be done when the inner problems and mutual interactions are fully recognized by the one who takes the initiative to dissolve an old tie. This will prevent him or her from forming a new relationship with similar underlying currents and interactions. It also means that the decision to sever the connection has been made because of growth, rather than as a result of spite, fear, or escape. Destructive interactions. To explore the underlying interaction and the various effects of a relationship where both people's difficulties are laid bare and accepted is by no means easy, but nothing can be more beautiful and rewarding. Anyone who comes into the state of enlightenment where this is possible will no longer fear any kind of interaction. Difficulties and fears arise to the exact degree that you still project on others your own problems in relating and still render others responsible for anything that goes against your liking. This can take many subtle forms. You may constantly concentrate on the faults of others because at first glance such concentration appears justified to you. You may subtly overemphasize one side of an interaction or exclude another. Such distortions indicate projection and denial of self-responsibility. So you want to, kind of be looking at yourself for these, but also look in the people that you're having difficulty with, because these are talking about both parties, right? And so the you there may be them and it may be you. And it helps to kind of just see it on both sides. So such distortions indicate projection and denial of self-responsibility for the difficulties in relating. This denial fosters dependency on the perfection of the other party, right? Can you see, like when we, need them to be a certain way so we can be happy, then we're dependent on them, right? And so it's this sort of self-sufficiency, this inner sovereignty that we're trying to find in this work. It's not about self-blame. It's not about, self-control, but it is about recognizing this inner sovereignty and letting go of this dependency on perfection in the other party. My dear friends, no matter what wrong the other person does, if you are disturbed, there must be something in you which that you overlook. When I say disturbed, I mean this in a particular sense. I do not speak of clear-cut anger that expresses itself guiltlessly and does not leave a trace of inner confusion and pain. I mean the kind of disturbance that comes out of conflict and breeds further conflict. A favorite tendency among people is to say, "You are doing it to me." The game of making others guilty is so pervasive that you hardly even notice it. One human being blames the other, one country blames the other, one group blames the other. This is a constant process at humanity's present level of development. It is indeed one of the most harmful and illusory processes imaginable. People derive pleasure from doing this, although the pain that ensues and the insoluble conflicts that follow are infinitely disproportionate to the puny momentary pleasure. Those who play this game truly harm themselves and others, and I strongly recommend that you begin to be aware of your blind involvement in this guilt-shifting game. But how about the victim? How is that person to cope? As a victim, your first problem is that you are not even aware of what is happening. Most of the time, the victimization happens in a subtle, emotional, and unarticulated fashion. The silent, covert blame is being launched without a spoken word. It is expressed indirectly in many ways. Now, obviously, the first necessity is concise, articulate awareness, for otherwise you will unconsciously respond in equally destructive, falsely self-defensive ways. Does that makes sense? Then neither person really knows the intricate levels of action, reaction, and interaction until the threads become so enmeshed that it seems impossible to disentangle them. Many a relationship has faltered due to such unconscious interaction. The launching of blame spreads poison, fear, and at least as much guilt as one tries to project. The recipients of this blame and guilt may react in many different ways according to their own problems and unresolved conflicts. as long as the reaction is blind and the projection of guilt unconscious, the counter reaction must also be neurotic and destructive. Only conscious perception can prohibit this. Only then will you be able to refuse a burden that is being placed on you. Only then can you articulate and pinpoint it. How to reach for fulfillment and pleasure. In a relationship that is about to blossom, one must be on the lookout for this pitfall, which is all the more difficult to detect because guilt projection is so widespread. Also, the recipients should look for it in themselves as well as the other. I do not mean here a straightforward confrontation about something the other person did wrong. I mean the subtle blame for personal unhappiness. This is what must be challenged. The only way you can avoid becoming a victim of blame and guilt projection is to avoid doing it yourself. To the degree you indulge yourself in a subtle negative attitude, you may do it in a different way than the one who does it to you, but you will be unaware of it being done to you and will therefore become victimized by it. The mere awareness will make all of the difference. Whether or not you verbally express your perception and confront the other person, only to the degree that you undefensively explore and accept your own problematic reactions and distortions, negativities and destructiveness, can you diffuse someone else's guilt projection. Only then will you not be drawn into a maze of falseness and confusion in which uncertainty, defensiveness, and weakness may make you retreat or become over-aggressive. Only then will you no longer confuse self-assertion with hostility or flexible compromise with unhealthy submission. These are the aspects which determine the ability to cope with relationships. So that makes sense, these, again, we're in these levels of duality where we, kind of go to one side or the other, and in our, defensive reactions. And so we, tend to go into, an aggression, over-aggression, or into an unhealthy submission. And the guide has said in the other lecture we read in this thing, like where it's like one is the masculine, one is the feminine, and where one is in distortion, the other is in distortion. So these are the aspects which determine the ability to cope with relationship. And the more profoundly understood and lived these new attitudes are, the more intimate, fulfilling, and beautiful human interaction will become. How can you assert your rights and reach into the universe for fulfillment and pleasure? How can you love without fear unless you approach relating to others the way I have outlined above? Unless by learning to do this you purify yourself, there must always be a threat when it comes to intimacy, that one or both will resort to using the whip of loading guilt upon the other. Loving, sharing, and profound and satisfying closeness to others could be a purely positive power without any threats if these snares were looked at, discovered, and dissolved. It is of utmost importance that you look for them in yourselves, my friends. The most challenging, beautiful, spiritually important, and growth-producing kind of relationship. Okay, so this is where we also get into some of the, diversity and, transgender and non-gendered stuff, but he says the kind of relationship between man and woman. So, I think that that's the man and woman, or the masculine and feminine in all of us. And I don't know, if there's a moral prohibition really about the other. It seems to me that wherever love is, we need to celebrate it. So I'm not going to get too picky about, where that love shows up. But the guide does kind of exalt this, and there may be a reason, for that as well. And certainly for those that are, of us that are heterosexual, that is the most beautiful kind of relationship, and growth producing, and day producing that we need. So the power that brings two people together in love and attraction, and the pleasure involved, are a small aspect of being in cosmic reality. Cosmic reality is this union, in this beautiful way. It is as though each created entity knew unconsciously about the bliss of this state, and sought to realize it in the most potent way, to open to humanity in love and sexuality between man and woman. The power that draws them together is the purest spiritual energy, leading to an inkling of the purest spiritual state. So here I think he's also kind of addressing some of the, beliefs in some traditions that sexuality is, like defiled or not so spiritual a state. So, but here he's saying, that there is a very beautiful spirituality in our divine sexuality. When a man and woman stay together in a more enduring and committed relationship, maintaining an even increasing bliss depends entirely on how the two relate to one another. Are they aware of the direct relationship between enduring pleasure and inner growth? It's part of what you were saying, Frank. We need to find a partner who can meet us in our growing process, right, and can support that. Do they use the inevitable difficulties in the relationship as yardsticks for their own inner difficulties? Do they communicate in the deepest, most truthful, self-revealing way, sharing their inner problems, helping each other? The answers to these questions will determine whether the relationship falters, dissolves, stagnates, or blossoms. When you look at the world around you, you will undoubtedly see that very few human beings grow and reveal themselves in such an open way. Equally few realize that growing together and through each other determines the solidity of feelings of pleasure, of enduring love and respect. It is therefore not surprising that long-lasting relationships are almost invariably more or less dead in feelings. So he's saying most of the relationships we see out there that are, long-lasting do not retain sort of the depth of creative possibility that is available to us in these relationships. Difficulties that arise in a relationship are always signals for something unattended to. They are a loud message for those who can hear it. The sooner it is heeded, the more spiritual energy will be released, so that the state of bliss can expand along with the inner being of both partners. There is a mechanism in a relationship between a man and a woman that can be likened to a very finely calibrated instrument that shows the finest and most subtle aspects of the relationship and the individual state of the two people involved. This is not sufficiently recognized by even the most aware and sophisticated people who are otherwise familiar with spiritual and psychological truth. Every day and every hour, one's inner state and feelings are a testimony to one's state of growth. To the degree they are heeded, the interaction, the feelings, the freedom of flow within and toward each other will blossom. The perfectly mature and spiritually valid relationship must always be deeply connected with personal growth. The moment a relationship is experienced as irrelevant to inner growth, left on its own, as it were, it will falter. Only when both grow to their ultimate inherent potential can the relationship become more and more dynamic and alive. This work has to be done individually and mutually. When relationship is approached in that way, it will be built on a rock, not sand. No fear will ever find room under such circumstances. Feelings will expand and security about the self and each other will grow. At any given moment, each partner will serve as a mirror to the inner state of the other, and therefore to the relationship. Wherever there is friction or deadness, it is an indication that something must be stuck. Some interaction between the two people remains unclear and it needs to be looked at. If it is understood and brought out into the open, growth will proceed at maximum speed and in the dimension of feeling happiness, bliss, profound experience, and ecstasy will become forever deeper and more beautiful, and life will acquire more meaning. Conversely, fear of intimacy implies rigidity and the denial of one's own share in the relationship's difficulties. Anyone who ignores these principles, who pays only lip service to them, is not ready to assume the responsibility for their inner suffering, either within the relationship or in its absence. So you see, my friends, it is of the greatest importance to recognize that bliss and beauty, which are eternal spiritual realities, are available to all those who seek the key to the problems of human interactions, as well as to loneliness, within their own hearts. True growth is as much a spiritual reality as our profound fulfillment, vibrant aliveness, and blissful, joyous relating. When you are inwardly ready to relate to another human being in such a fashion, you will find the appropriate partner with whom this manner of sharing is possible. It will no longer frighten you. It will no longer beset you with conscious or unconscious fears when you use this all-important key. You cannot ever feel helpless or victimized when the significant transition has taken place in your life, and you no longer render others responsible for what you experience or fail to experience. Thus, growth and fulfilled, beautiful living become one and the same. May you all carry with you this new material and an inner energy awakened by your goodwill. May these words be the beginning of a new inner modality to meet life, to finally decide, I want to risk my good feelings. I want to seek the cause in me rather than the other person so that I become free to love. This kind of meditation will indeed bear fruit. If you carry away a germ, a particle of this lecture, it has truly been fruitful. Be blessed, all of you, my dearest friends, so that you become the gods that you potentially are. Okay, we all made it through. That's pretty good. This is definitely, some strong, hard material sometimes. But again, if we don't have our inner critic or self-judge or ISI, then I think we can meet this, without the shame and the confusion or the, feeling that, well, if it's not their fault, then it must be my fault. It's like there's never it's like it's always a dynamic and an interaction. And so it's just beautiful just to say, okay, well, let me explore what's the part that I'm dealing with, and that will take me into a place where I can receive some healing for myself. And then from there, maybe it shifts the dynamic in the relationship. And if it doesn't, then it's getting more clear that maybe the partnership is, not mutual enough to develop this beautiful mutuality that we're all seeking. And then when we try to enforce it or make them give it to us or, whatever, then it doesn't seem to help us that way either. Okay, I'm done. Anybody else? Any last comments here?
Thank you, Darlene.
Yeah, you're welcome. Strong medicine, but beautiful in many ways. So, and the biggest thing that I learned in myself, and I mean, when I read these lectures in the beginning, I mean, it was very difficult. So I do really understand this in my own journey. I felt like the guide was just constantly scolding me. And
Wow.
when I woke up, I discovered, oh, that's not the case at all, but that's how it feels, right?
I think that's why a lot of people leave Pathwork. It's because they feel like the guide is constantly scolding them.
You think that they like that?
Good on you that you hung in there.
Exactly. Yeah, because there's something more going on than that for sure. And again, it's my own internal self-judgment that is taking that in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to recognize can lead to the healing of that, How we heal that inner critic and self-judger, I don't, it's like it is healed, it can be healed, I can testify to that, but I don't have a perfect formula for it, but we're all just kind of stumbling around. And I think in some ways, as we do that, we learn our territory, and then like he says, we understand ourselves, we understand these dynamics, and it's from that depth of understanding that we can find the way to unravel it and shift it. So It just that and the grace and love of the universe that carries us on this journey and helps us meet another person maybe that really does, it's a different dynamic. We have a new possibility arise, or something shifts in the world that we're in, to break open kind of our cosmic egg of however we're sort of stuck in suffering. And there is grace that comes to help us with all of that. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. very
Thank
much.
you, Darlene.
Good night, everyone.
Good to see you again.
Good seeing everyone.
Care. Bye-bye.